Almost everyone alive can picture the same scene. A boy, a dark cave, a battered brass lamp lying in the dust. He rubs it. Something enormous pours out of the spout in a column of smoke, folds its arms, and offers him 3 wishes. You have seen that image so many times, it feels ancient. It feels like something the desert has been telling for 1,000 years. It is about 300 years old. It was written down in French, and there is no Arabic manuscript of it that anyone has ever found. The man who wrote it was a Paris Orientalist. He heard the story in a room in Paris in 1709 from a young traveler from Aleppo. He put it in a book of Arabian tales, and it swallowed everything that came before it. Because underneath that lamp there is something older, and much stranger, and much less obedient. Not a servant, not a wish machine, a second race of intelligent beings living alongside us, hidden, with their own tribes, their own quarrels, their own religions, their own funerals. They are called the Jinn, and they were never anybody's staff. And behind them stands a whole lost religious world. Gods carved into cliff faces, goddesses named on the sides of caravan routes. Temples in Yemen that ran for 1,000 years. Stone blocks worshipped without a face. Arrows cast in the dark to ask a god a question. Most of it is gone. What survives is scattered across 4 completely different kinds of evidence, written centuries apart. And almost every version of this story you have ever heard mashes those 4 together into one soup. Here is the one thing I want you to take away. Every time somebody tells you what pre-Islamic Arabia believed, ask which layer they are reading from. The answer changes the story completely. So let us do this properly. Start with the hardest question. How does anyone know anything at all about Arabian religion before Islam? There are 4 sources of knowledge, and they are not equal, and they do not agree. Layer 1 is stone. Tens of thousands of inscriptions scratched into rock across the northern deserts, and monumental temple texts across the south. These are contemporary. Somebody carved them while the religion was alive. Nobody edited them afterwards. Layer 2 is the Quran, 7th century. It talks about the old gods, but it is arguing with them, not describing them. Layer 3 is medieval Arabic literature, hadith collections, chronicles, the great encyclopedias, and one very famous little book about idols. That book is the Book of Idols by Ibn al-Kalbi, written around 800 years after Christ. Almost every colorful detail you have ever read about Arabian paganism comes from it. The statues, the sanctuaries, the destructions. And here is the problem. Ibn al-Kalbi is writing about a world that had been gone for roughly 2 centuries before he picked up a pen. Scholars still use him. He is the fullest account that exists. But modern historians treat him with real caution, and doubts about him go back to the 9th century. Where the stone and the Book of Idols disagree, the stone wins. That is the rule for this entire video. And layer 4 is the newest of all. 18th century Europe. Translation, embellishment, and outright invention. That layer is where the lamp lives. We will get there, and I will show you the exact date it was added. 4 layers: stone, scripture, medieval literature, European romance. Never blend them. Now, the gods. Begin with 3 names because they are the 3 the Quran itself puts on the record. al-lat, al-uzza, Manat. The chapter called The Star names all 3 together and asks a question about them. And the fact that Scripture names them means we are not relying on legend. Somebody in 7th century Arabia definitely knew who they were. Al-lat first. Her name is barely a name at all. It looks like the feminine of the word for God, the goddess, and she is old. Herodotus, writing in Greek in the 5th century before Christ, says the Arabs worship a goddess he calls al-lat. He identifies her with Aphrodite of the heavens. That is a Greek doing what Greeks always did, translating a foreign god into one of his own. But it means she was famous enough to reach Greece 1,000 years before Islam. Then the stone. Her name appears in Safavidic and Hismaic graffiti across the northern deserts, in Nabatean, in Palmyrene Aramaic, in South Arabian script. That is 4 separate writing systems across an enormous stretch of land. She is the most widely attested deity in the whole Arabian world. And what do people actually ask her for? Not thunder, not victory. Read the graffiti. They ask her for protection while traveling. They ask her for mercy. One asks her for relief from loneliness. That is a herdsman alone in a lava field with a rock and a sharp stone, telling a goddess he is lonely. In Nabatean inscription, she is called the goddess who is in Iram. She had a temple there. At Palmyra, she had a temple where lots were cast. One inscription there mentions a silver basin used for casting the lots. So, a goddess of protection, of travel, and of asking questions you cannot answer yourself. Now the later layer. Ibn al-Kalbi says al-lat had a sanctuary at Ta'if in the mountains above Mecca. He describes a cube of granite decorated with gold and onyx. He says a man was appointed to grind barley meal for pilgrims there. That detail is charming, and I want it to be true. It is also 200 years downstream of the events. Hold it loosely. Second name, al-uzza, the mighty one. She turns up on Nabatean Betials, and the Greeks and Romans matched her to Aphrodite, the same translation move they made for al-lat. There is a relief from Hatra, 2nd century after Christ, showing al-lat flanked by 2 female figures. They may be al-uzza and manat. Nobody can prove it. Ibn al-Kalbi puts her sanctuary at Nakhla and says 3 trees there were sacred to her. And he tells the story of her destruction, tree by tree, by a commander sent from Medina who has to go back twice because the job is not finished. It is a great scene. It is also exactly the kind of scene a later writer builds. There is no archaeology confirming it. Third name, Manat. And her name is the one that should stop you. It comes from a root meaning to a portion, to a lot, to measure out somebody's share. Manat is fate. She is the Arabian member of the same family as the Greek Moirai, whose name also means portions. 2 civilizations that never coordinated, both deciding that destiny is fundamentally an act of division. Her names are attested in pre-Islamic personal names, and there is a case that she is the oldest of the 3, not the youngest. Her great shrine stood on the Red Sea coast, between Mecca and Medina. Pilgrims shaved their heads there. And 2 tribes of Medina, the Aus and the Khazraj, were especially devoted to her. Which matters, because those are the tribes that later invited Muhammad to their city. The old world and the new one are not 2 separate rooms. And then there is the 4th name, the one that is not in the Quran at all, hubal. If you have heard one Arabian idol named, it is probably this one. Everything we know about him comes from Ibn al-Kalbi and early Islamic historians, not from scripture, not from an inscription anybody can hold up. The description is vivid, an image in human shape, carved from red agate, standing at the Kaaba in Mecca, and the right hand had broken off, so they replaced it with a hand of gold. Think about what that means for a second. Somebody looked at a damaged god and decided the answer was jewelry. In front of him lay 7 arrows. Those were the oracle. You came with a question you could not settle, a disputed parentage, a marriage, a death, a journey. The arrows were cast. The god answered, and you went home with a verdict you had not chosen. That is not superstition. That is a legal system. In a society with no courts, a god who casts lots is the appeals process. And there is one moment where hubal steps out of legend and into the earliest Islamic sources, shouted aloud on a battlefield. The Battle of Uhud near Medina. The Meccans have the upper hand, and their commander Abu Sufyan calls out across the field, "Be exalted, Hubal." And then we have al-uzza, and you have no uzza. And the reply comes back from the Muslim line. God is higher and more majestic. God is our protector, and you have no protector. That exchange is preserved in the Hadith collection of al-Bukhari and in the earliest biography of Muhammad. And it is the closest thing we have to hearing the old religion speak in its own voice. 2 lines, shouted, in anger, at the end. Which brings us to the hardest question in the whole subject. What about Allah? Because here is the thing that surprises people. The name is not new in the 7th century. It is there before Islam, in the inscriptions, and in the names people gave their children. Muhammad's own father was named Abdullah, servant of Allah, named by a pagan family in a pagan city before the Quran existed. You do not name your son that, unless the name already means something to you. There is a Christian martyr inscription from Zabad dated 512 using the Arabic word for the god in both Arabic and Aramaic. Other supposed early attestations have been contested and retranslated and contested again. This field argues about single letters, but there is a broader pattern in the epigraphy that is hard to argue with. Across the 5th and 6th centuries in northern and western Arabia, the inscriptions stop naming many gods. They start naming only one. The old plural pantheon thins out on the rock face itself generations before Islam. And the Quran tells you the same thing from the other side because it keeps arguing with people who already accept a creator. Its opponents are not atheists. They agree there is a supreme God who made the world. They just will not stop hedging. And that is the shape scholars reconstruct. Not one God against no gods. One God at the top, surrounded by intermediaries. Which is where the phrase you have probably heard comes from, the daughters of Allah. The idea, as later Muslim tradition reports it, was that al-lat, al-uzza, and manat were the daughters of the high God. Not rivals, relatives, not competitors for the throne, family who could be asked to put in a word. And the Quran attacks that specific arrangement with an argument that is almost sarcastic. You assign daughters to God, it says, and sons to yourselves. In a society that valued sons, that is a devastating line. Now hold on, because the epigraphy complicates the family tree in an interesting way. In Nabatean inscriptions, al-lat is not called anybody's daughter. Some read her as the god's wife instead. And in Safavitic graffiti, the great god of Petra is called the son of al-lat. Daughter in one corpus, wife in another, mother in a third. That is not one theology. That is several, in different valleys, in different centuries. This is exactly the trap. Arabia was not one religion with one family tree. It was a continent of local arrangements. Speaking of Petra, go north to the rose-red city cut into the sandstone, and you enter a completely different religious world. The Nabateans, caravan kings. They controlled the incense roads and got rich on frankincense and myrrh moving north. Their chief god was Dushara, and the name is not really a name either. It seems to mean the one of the Shara. The Shara are the mountains behind Petra, so their supreme god is called more or less him of those mountains. The Greeks and Romans, meeting him, called him Zeus and sometimes Dionysus. Everyone translates. He was worshipped at Petra and at Hegra in the north of what is now Saudi Arabia, where he was the patron god. Safavitic inscriptions record animal sacrifices to him. People ask him for justice if he is called on with the right ritual. And his cult traveled. There was a shrine to him in the harbor of Puteoli in Italy, because that is where the trade went. Now the thing that makes Nabatean religion visually unforgettable. They mostly did not carve faces. They worshipped beetles, stone blocks, plain rectangles cut from the cliff or set in a niche. Some are utterly blank. Some have 2 square eyes and a bar for a nose, reduced almost to a diagram of a face. Walk the gorge into Petra, and they are cut into the rock beside you the whole way in. Small doorways with nobody in them. And scholars still argue about what a beetle was. A container the god comes to occupy, or the god himself in the only shape allowed. That argument has never been settled, and I think it is the single most interesting unresolved question in Arabian religion, because it means the most sophisticated trading empire in the region deliberately chose not to give its gods a face. Now go south. Because if you think Arabia is deserts and tents, the south will correct you fast. South Arabia is Yemen. And it was not a nomad society. It was a civilization of stone cities, dams, and irrigation, with kingdoms lasting over a millennium. Saba, Ma'and, Kataban, Hadramaut, and later Himyar, each with its own alphabet-carved monumental script and its own national god. This is not a variation on the religion of Mecca. It is a separate world with a separate pantheon, and lumping them together is a mistake. Start at the top. Athtar, he is the planet Venus, as the morning star. And note the pronoun, he, because the same Venus deity is female almost everywhere else in the Semitic world. Ishtar in Babylon, Astarte in the Levant. South Arabia keeps the name and flips the gender. Their Venus is a male god of thunderstorms who sends the rain, which tells you something about the place. In a land that lives and dies by irrigation, the god who brings water outranks everything. And he does outrank everything. In the inscriptions, Athtar always appears first in the list. He presided over the whole world. Kings held ritual banquets in his honor, paid for out of the tithe the population gave him. There were ritual hunts, recorded with a set phrase. The day when he performed the hunt for Athtar, carved into stone again and again over centuries. Below him, each kingdom had its own god. And for Saba, the great kingdom of the Queen of Sheba's legend, that god was Al-Makah. The ruling dynasty of Saba described themselves as his seed, not chosen by him, descended from him. His great temple was the Awam, outside Marib, the place local tradition calls the sanctuary of Bilqis. It was his main oracular seat, and a pilgrimage destination for all of South Arabia in a specific month of the year. Hold that thought. A pilgrimage season, a named month, crowds converging on one sanctuary in Yemen. Centuries before Islam, the temple stayed in use into the 4th century after Christ, and hundreds of inscriptions have been dug out of it. Now, if you look al-Makkah up in an older book, it will tell you flatly that he is the moon god. You will see it stated everywhere. That identification is contested, and it has been for decades. Scholars including Garbini and Jacqueline Perrin challenged it. Jacques Reichmans noted that the bull's head and the vine associated with him may point in a solar direction instead. His symbol is a cluster of lightning bolts around a curved, sickle-shaped weapon. His epithets include Lord of the Ibexes, bulls, vines, lightning, ibexes. That is not an obvious moon god. That is a warrior with a herd. So when somebody tells you South Arabia worshiped the moon, the honest answer is maybe. It is an old label, and the evidence underneath it is thinner than the confidence. Third of the southern gods, Wad. He was the national god of Ma'in, the kingdom of the Manaeans, and his name simply means love or affection. There is a formula that appears on amulets and buildings. Wad is father, 2 words repeated across a kingdom like a seal. And here is the detail that makes him real to me. There is an altar on the Greek island of Delos. It was set up by Manaeans, and it is inscribed twice, once in their own script and once in Greek. The Greek reads, property of Oidos, god of the Manaeans, a Yemeni god labeled in Greek on a Greek island, so the locals knew whose altar it was. That is the incense trade in one object. These people were not isolated. They were merchants with a diaspora. And Wad is one of the very few of these southern gods who is named in the Quran, in a list of gods the people of Noah refused to abandon. So there is a second layer confirming the first. Stone says he existed. Scripture says his name was still remembered. Now the ending nobody tells you, and it changes the whole story of Arabia. South Arabian polytheism did not survive to be swept away by Islam. It died long before. In the late 4th century, in Himyar, the kingdom that had absorbed Saba, the inscriptions change. Overnight, in historical terms, the gods stopped being named. No Athtar, no Al-Makkah, no Wad. In their place appears one title, Ramanan, the Merciful, Lord of Heaven and earth. Jewish and Aramaic vocabulary appears alongside it, and Jewish personal names. Scholars date the shift to the reign of a king around 375 to 400. One inscription records a temple of Al-Makkah being replaced by a different kind of building altogether, possibly a synagogue. Read that again. A 1,000-year-old state cult was decommissioned, and the record of it is a building permit. Then came Christianity and armies. Around the year 500, the Christian kingdom of Aksum, from across the Red Sea, invaded and installed its own king. A Jewish king seized power back. There was a massacre of Christians at Najran. Aksum returned, and a general named Abraha ended up ruling Yemen. So the century before Muhammad in southern Arabia is not an age of idols. It is Jewish kings and Christian generals fighting over a monotheist kingdom, which reframes everything. Arabia was not one dark room waiting for a light. Parts of it had been arguing about one god for 200 years. Now, underneath all the gods, everywhere, north and south, there was another category of being entirely, not gods, not people, something in between and much closer to the ground. And the earliest hard evidence for them is not in Arabia at all. It is in Syria at Palmyra. Palmyra was a caravan city, an oasis empire, Aramaic speaking with a large Arab population. And in its inscriptions there is a class of beings called the Jinnaye. They are described in one text as the good and rewarding gods. They protect caravans, cattle, and desert villages. They have shrines. They get thanked by name. They are the ones you appeal to when you are out on the road with animals and cargo. Now say the word again. Genie, Jinn. The link is obvious, and it is also disputed, and I want to be precise about how. The archaeologist William Albright argued the word is not originally Arabic at all, but Aramaic, and that jinn entered Arabian folklore late. Other scholars argue the reverse, that the Arabic word is older and the Palmyrene form is borrowed from it. And there is a third complication. The Romans occupied Palmyra, and they had their own protective spirits, the genii. Genii. The resemblance is close enough that scholars think the Roman presence encouraged the overlap. So the truth is a tangle. What we can say is that guardian spirits of the caravan road are attested in stone centuries before the Quran. And what they do is protective and local. They keep your camels alive. Nobody in these inscriptions is asking one for 3 wishes. Now the jinn themselves. And start with the word, because the word contains the whole idea. The Arabic root is jinn. It means to cover, to conceal, to hide. And the family of words built from it is remarkable. Jannah is a garden, because a garden is hidden under its own foliage. Janin is an embryo, hidden in the body. Majnun means insane, because your mind is covered over by something. And jinn are simply the hidden ones, not evil, not fiery, not malicious, concealed. That is the entire definition, which is a much better idea than a monster. The jinn are the population of everything you cannot see. Now the fire. Everybody knows the phrase. Jinn are made of smokeless fire, and that is half right, which is worse than wrong, because the Quran actually gives 2 different descriptions. One passage says the jinn were created from a marriage of fire. Translators render it a smokeless flame, or fire free of smoke. But a different passage uses a different phrase entirely, and translators split badly over it. Some render it scorching fire, some the fire of a scorching wind, some intensely hot fire, some do say smokeless. So the famous slogan is one verse in one reading, hardened into a universal fact. The scripture is less tidy than the meme. Now here is the part that genuinely matters, and the part the lamp destroyed. There is an entire chapter of the Quran named for the jinn, and what happens in it is not a haunting. It is a conversion. A group of jinn overhear a recitation. They listen, and they go back to their own people and report what they heard. They renounce the false gods they had been serving. They argue theology among themselves, and the chapter says plainly that there are classes among them. Some believe, some do not. Some are righteous, and some are not. Believers go where believers go. Unbelievers go where unbelievers go. They are judged on exactly the terms we are. Stop and sit with that. This is not a category of spirit. This is a category of person. A being with free will, moral responsibility, an afterlife, and the capacity to be argued into changing its mind. There is nothing quite like it in Greek myth, nothing like it in Norse, a parallel civilization, hidden and accountable. The same chapter preserves 2 details that are pure old Arabia, fossilized inside scripture. First, it says that men used to seek refuge with the jinn, specifically when frightened, specifically when passing through a valley. That is a real pre-Islamic road custom, recorded as a thing people did. You entered strange country, and you asked its hidden residents for safe passage. Second, it says the Jinn used to climb up to eavesdrop at the gates of heaven and carry what they overheard back down. That is where the soothsayers got their material. And the chapter says the sky is now full of meteors, guarding against exactly that, which is an extraordinary image. Every shooting star is a shot fired at an eavesdropper, and the Jinn appear elsewhere. Iblis, the figure who refuses to bow, is identified as being of the Jinn, not of the angels, which solves a problem because angels do not disobey. A Genie can. That is the whole point of a Genie. And in the story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, there is a single line that launched 1,000 later legends. Solomon asks who can bring him her throne, and one of them speaks up. An Ifrit of the Jinn says, "I will bring it to you before you rise from your place." And then somebody else does it faster. The Ifrit loses. Even here, at the origin of the servant Genie image, the Genie is outperformed. Now, the taxonomy, the Marids, the Ifrits, the ghouls, and I need to be honest about where those come from. The ranked hierarchy you find in fantasy games and internet lists is not scripture. It is medieval literature and folk tradition. The word Ifrit does appear in the Quran once in that line about Solomon's throne, but mainstream Islamic scholarship reads it there as an adjective. Something like a powerful one, a rebellious one, not the name of a species with statistics. Its etymology is argued over too. Arab philologists connect it to a verb about rolling something in the dust, and to slyness and cunning. Some Western scholars have proposed a Persian origin instead, from a verb meaning to create, and even an Avestan root. It is not settled. Then the ghoul. And the ghoul is the oldest and the most frightening, because the ghoul is not a servant of anything. The name comes from a verb meaning to seize. She lives in the wilderness, near burial grounds, and she eats people. And note the pronoun again. In early Arabic the word is feminine. The male form comes later. The classic method is not violence. It is disguise. She appears as an old woman, or as a relative you lost. She calls to you as someone you would trust, out in the dark, off the road, and you go to her. The female counterpart in the sources is called the Sila, and folklorists record her as Mother Ghoul in later popular tradition. A famous pre-Islamic poem has the poet Ta'abata Sharan fight one and win. And centuries later the great essayist al-Jahiz was scornful about him for boasting about it. Even in the 9th century, somebody was rolling his eyes. And Islam takes a position on the ghoul, and the position is interesting. A tradition holds that lonely travelers can drive one off simply by making the call to prayer. And another says that a ghoul, unlike a devil, could in principle convert. Hearing the right verse recited, it might submit. So even the man-eater in the graveyard is inside the moral system, not outside it. That is consistent, and it is not what fantasy does with monsters. Now the strangest relationship of all, the Jinn and the poets. In pre-Islamic Arabia, the poet was not an entertainer. The word is sha'ir, and it means the one who knows. A tribe's poet was its weapon and its archive. He praised, he cursed, he remembered, and a great satire could break a man's standing. And the explanation for where the verse came from was not talent, it was a partner. The belief, recorded in an early anthology of Arab poetry, is that every poet had a counterpart poet among the Jinn. Not a muse, not an inspiration, a specific individual with a name and a clan. The anthology even names one, the Jinn poet said to belong to Imruz al-Qais, the most famous poet of them all. And there is a place attached to this, a valley called Abkar. The legend says that if you spent a night in Abkar, you would meet the Jinn there, and one would attach itself to you, and it would teach you poetry for the rest of your life, so long as you kept invoking its name and its clan, which is a contract. You get the words, you keep the credit shared. And this is the world into which a man in Mecca began reciting something extraordinary in rhythmic Arabic. So of course that was the accusation thrown at him, that he was a poet, that he was Majnun, Jinn-touched. And the Quran denies it directly and repeatedly. Not a poet, not possessed. Those denials only make sense in a culture where Jinn-inspired verse was the normal explanation for anyone who suddenly started speaking above his own level. Now, the lamp. The 1001 Nights is real, and it is old, and it is Arabic. Let us start with what genuinely exists. There is a paper fragment from the 9th century, identified by the scholar Nabia Abbott, carrying the title of a Book of 1,000 Nights. That is the earliest surviving trace of the collection. 200 years before the Norman conquest of England. In the 10th century, the Baghdad bookseller al-Nadim describes a Persian book called Hazar Afsan, 1,000 Tales, and he describes the frame story. A king who kills each wife until one saves herself by telling stories. That machine is Persian, and it is very old. But the fullest early manuscript we actually possess, the one everything descends from, dates from somewhere between 1450 and 1593. It is called the Galland manuscript, after the man who owned it, and it is a Syrian text. In the 20th century, the scholar Muhsin Mahdi produced a critical edition from it. It remains the only true critical edition of the Nights, and the core of tales in that oldest layer includes the merchant and the genie, the fisherman and the genie, the porter and the 3 ladies, the 3 apples. So Jinn stories are absolutely authentic to the Nights, genuinely medieval, genuinely Arabic, and look at how one of them behaves, because it is nothing like the cartoon. In The Fisherman and the Genie, a poor man drags a sealed vessel out of the sea and opens it. The genie comes out. And the genie's first act is to inform the fisherman that he is about to be killed, because he had sworn across centuries of imprisonment that whoever freed him early would be rewarded, and whoever freed him late would die. Nobody came early, so the fisherman has to outthink him, and he does it with a trick, not a wish. That is the medieval genie. Enormous, ancient, bitter, dangerous, and beatable only by cleverness. Now, here is where the 4th layer arrives, and it arrives with a date. Antoine Galland, French Orientalist, is translating the Nights into French. He runs low on material. On the 25th of March, 1709, his diary records a meeting. A young Maronite Christian from Aleppo, Hannah Diab, who had traveled to Paris with a French traveler named Paul Lucas. Diab tells him stories. Galland writes them down, and 2 of them become the most famous stories in the entire collection, Aladdin and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. For Aladdin specifically, Galland's diary indicates he received a written text rather than an oral performance, and so recorded no summary of it. He worked it up in the winter of 1709 to 10 and published it in volumes 9 and 10 in 1710. And here is the fact. No authentic Arabic textual source for Aladdin has ever been found. Not in the Galland manuscript, not in any manuscript that predates Galland, nowhere. 2 Arabic manuscripts of Aladdin did turn up later, and Muhsin Mahdi examined them. Both, he concluded, are back translations. Somebody took Galen's French and turned it into Arabic, and it circulated as if it were the original. Aladdin and Ali Baba are known in the scholarship as the orphan tales, stories with no parents in the manuscript tradition. And some scholars now argue Hannah Diab should be treated as the story's author, not merely its source, with elements of his own life inside it, which would make the most famous Arabian story in the world an original work by a young Syrian traveler written in Paris, published under a Frenchman's name. And there is one more detail people find hard to believe until they check. Aladdin is not set in Arabia. The story opens in one of the cities of China, a China with sultans and viziers and Muslim references, which is to say, not China at all, but a generic elsewhere. Now the word itself, genie. It comes into English from the French genie, which comes from the Latin genius, a protective spirit of a person or a place. And the reason a Latin word ended up meaning an Arabic being is that the two words happen to sound alike. Linguists call that phono-semantic matching. You reach for the native word that sounds closest and give it a new job. So the word genie is not the Arabic word at all. It is a European word wearing it. And that is the whole story in miniature. A translation choice made in Paris, and 300 years later it is what the world means by the thing. So let us lay the 4 layers out one last time and see what actually happened. Layer 1, the stone. Al-lat asked for mercy and company by a lonely herdsman. Aftar bringing the rain. Al-Makka with his ibexes. Genie guarding the caravan. Layer 2, the Quran. Jinn as a parallel nation with free will, arguing about God, judged like us, and the road custom of asking a valley for permission. Layer 3, medieval literature. The taxonomy. The ghoul in the graveyard. The poet with a partner in Abkar. The furious prisoner in the fisherman's jar. Layer 4, 18th century Paris. A lamp. 3 wishes. A servant. And notice the direction of travel. It only ever shrinks. It starts as everything you cannot see. It becomes a rival people. It becomes a bestiary. It becomes an employee. The oldest jinn in the record protect caravans and cannot be commanded. The newest one lives in a brass lamp and asks what you would like. And the gods went the same way. A goddess attested in 4 scripts across 1,000 years became a footnote in somebody's list of idols. A temple in Yemen that ran for a millennium became a name in a legend about a queen. Almost none of it was written down by its own believers as belief. What we have is graffiti, trade receipts, and the arguments of its opponents. And still, out of that, you can hear them. Be exalted, hubal. Wad is father. Grant me relief from loneliness. 3 lines, scratched or shouted by people who thought somebody was listening. That is Arabian mythology. Not superstition and not a cartoon. 1,000 years of people out on hard ground asking the hidden world for terms. And the next time something enormous comes out of a lamp and offers you 3 wishes, remember what it used to be. It used to be the thing you asked permission from before you entered the valley.